the business cycles.
Speaking for myself, making errors tends to happen when I'm either overextended and tired, and I would include here trying to do things when I'm sick, or when I'm trying something where I'm stretched past my current level of expertise and ability. I notice that if I feel disproportionately bad about the mistake, it has to do with believing that I was supposed to be something that I'm not. Like, for example, not tired, not inexperienced. And this is typically combined with some aspect of a self-awareness and a communication gap, not being upfront and honest with myself or others or both. So I want to make a case for the role of self-awareness in both avoiding mistakes and correcting and recovering from them. Most established organizations have some kind of protocol for mistakes. Maybe you work for a store and you're registered short $15 at the end of the day, or you're in finance and you use an incorrect formula in an Excel sheet for an important piece of analysis, or you forgot to get your sales leaders sign off on giving a discount to an important customer. There may be a set of procedures to go through after a mistake. These include things such as reporting, documenting the error, assessing, analyzing its impact and root cause, communicating the issue to key stakeholders, and potentially creating corrective actions such as preventive measures to ensure the mistake doesn't happen again. At a minimum, most organizations will have some form of discussion or post-mortem review with lessons learned. While an organization will be involved in these kinds of processes to ensure understanding and learning from the mistake, rarely do managers discuss how to recover from making a mistake, either emotionally or politically. It's impossible to get a sense of the total number of workplace mistakes and their impact. But we know that a study by Johns Hopkins in 2016 estimated that 250,000 deaths have been attributed to medical error. And OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, cites 2.8 million non-fatal workplace illnesses and injuries, many of which may be directly attributable to mistakes or lapses in safety protocols. The point is, mistakes happen. Our focus for this episode will be on recovering from them. The ability to navigate a mistake with an appropriate level of accountability and self-awareness is crucial to your work relationships and your professional brand and your credibility. It's also an important part of the bigger picture task of growing self-awareness. So through self-knowledge and deeper awareness of our motivations, we have a chance to lead more conscious, intentional, happier, and successful lives.
And we'll be right back. I had a young woman working for me some years ago, let's call her Evie, who was very bright and had a lot of potential. She'd worked her way up in the company and had a grit and determination that I admired. I was aware that she needed support, but also opportunities to stretch and grow. And I remember being very thoughtful at the time about getting this balance right. I didn't want to push her too far or fast because we were in a hyper-competitive and high-performing environment. So my group held a global offsite every year. These were extensively planned 3-day events with a good mix of business talk, personal interaction, and bonding. Since I designed the agenda and the itinerary, I offered to give Evie a short presentation slot on the last day so she could get some visibility and well-earned recognition for the internal projects she was heading up for me and the group. She was excited about the opportunity and shared with me what she had planned to discuss, a mix of operational improvements and some longer-term projects she was doing by herself. After our informal chat, she sent me 3 nice slides that she had put together. The quality of her presentation was strong, and she was extremely excited to be participating in the meeting instead of just helping organize it. Evie had a 10-minute slot at 3 p.m. on the last day. We'd lost some international colleagues who had to catch flights, so she had a smaller group to present to, maybe 20 colleagues, most of whom were from our office and knew her well. I introduced her. She came up to the front of the room, progressed her slide, and then something very odd happened. She sort of froze for a while, and when she began to talk, I don't know how to really describe it, except that it was a bit like hearing someone speaking in tongues. She was so nervous that the words coming out of her mouth didn't really make sense. She tried to present without any speaking notes, and her nerves got the best of her, and she was struggling to dig out. I felt terrible, but it occurred to me that it would have been worse to interrupt her, so I let her finish. Luckily, the colleagues in the room stayed engaged and clapped politely when she finished. Evie approached me the next day to apologize for what had happened. We went for a walk to a local park and sat and talked for a while. She told me that she knew it didn't go well and was flooded with embarrassment and worry that everyone would think her incompetent. My advice to Evie was to pause and focus on soothing herself, with the idea that if you aren't making mistakes, you aren't pushing yourself enough. When the initial shock of embarrassment, fear, shame hits, it's best to tell yourself this until those self-critical feelings start to dissipate. This is super important, especially for folks who grew up in overly critical and or emotionally withholding environments where love and your value was conditional and based on performative behaviors. Once you're calm and not feeling emotionally flooded by feelings, test and do a quick objective assessment of what happened and be realistic about its impact. In Evie's example, she didn't do something that was going to get her fired or send the company into financial ruin. Though emotionally, sure, I knew that she felt pretty bad in the moment. Next, I advised Evie to admire the lesson. Why admire? Because it's a verb we don't usually apply to mistakes, so it sounds incongruent in our mind. Our thinking brain wakes up and tries to make sense of why it should admire something negative. Admiration is to regard something with respect or warm approval. So use curiosity and creativity to admire the lesson in the mistake. For Evie, the experience taught her that while she had good verbal, written, and PowerPoint skills, public speaking was an area she wasn't naturally gifted at, just yet. Working in our company, she had seen countless presentations in public speaking. And on the plus side, she had the confidence in herself to try it, which is awesome. The experience gave her an important lesson that she needed to learn a bit more about the art of speaking. This lesson was a real gift for her. The presentation was made in a small group amongst friendly people she knew. It was even a smaller group than had been planned. And those who remained attended out of respect and genuine interest in her. They were also tired and hungover from the night before, but that's another story for another show. In all seriousness, not only did everyone in the room want Evie to succeed, but they had all once been in the exact same position, so could empathize with her. The last thing I told Evie was to realize the opportunity. This experience helped her recognize a gap in her knowledge base that would be important to address if she wanted to continue growing her career and opening up more opportunities for herself at the firm. She asked me if I would sponsor her for training and then arrange to practice presenting with one or two colleagues before trying again at another meeting in the future. The mistake became an important catalyst for Evie's leveling up in her career. If she hadn't made it, or if she allowed it to undermine her confidence, she wouldn't have been able to eventually go on to bigger things, which I'm happy to report she absolutely did.
That was such a great vignette. I mean, you're such an excellent storyteller, Mary, and you had me on the edge of my seat. And I want to underline in bold what you said about curiosity, creativity, and as the word you used is admiration. To remain open instead of defensive. There is nothing that creates organizational toxicity and signals a lack of command than pointing fingers and only blaming outside circumstances. Usually it's a mix of factors, outside your immediate influence that could have been better positioned, along with personal responsibility for how we responded to them. But, one note I'll say is that actually for people who experience that like Evie, where it's like a real shock to the system, I have a tendency to really shrug things off. And I think that the limitation that creates for me is that I'm less prone to learn from those errors because they don't upset me that much. So, so for folks who are really struggling with being upset, is realizing and kind of using the admiration that you're talking about to really look at these as opportunities to seek growth and level up your career. But you're so good, Mary, with speaking notes. I've been so off the cuff for my career, and working on the pod with you has leveled me up. I'm like the Eliza Doolittle to your Henry Higgins. And that's a reference for the seniors in our audience.
I love that reference. That's cool.
Business cycles. Yeah. The business cycles.
So I want to use a recent example of a fumble, but the specifics would reveal an active negotiation. So I'll reach back a bit. So when I think of my leadership career, I think the theme of my biggest mistakes, personally, was making promises that became difficult to keep, something we've talked about in other episodes, and having to spend valuable political capital to uphold them, and also valuable emotional energy. So my examples are so boring compared to Mary's. So I'm going to try to see if I can make this interesting, but it's going to be what it's going to be. So the example I'll use here would be two different outcomes for the same issue. Forgive me if this is a little bit dry, but in software sales, the lifetime value of a contract is factored into determining the valuation of the company. So the term of renewal of a deal can make a $100,000 contract worth 4 to 15 times more, depending on how the investors are calculating the valuation of the company. So negotiating contracts can be challenging. So from the on the ground of the individual sales contributors, it takes time. And especially if a customer has a lot of, it's called red lines or proposed changes to the agreement. And it can be a slog, and it can be frustrating for a sales rep who's trying to meet the deadline of a quota for many obvious reasons that have to do with their own career and also their income. So in this one case that I'll use, a rep, I'm going to call him Tom, made an unapproved edit to the auto renewal language in the contract to get the deal signed for the quarter, allowing termination for non-cause, which means they can cancel the contract for no reason after the first year. So the value of the contract is 1 year. It was discovered, and ultimately the issue was with Tom's ability to solve problems and have challenging conversations, and his inability to consider what's best for the company, or at least I thought. And the most memorable part of this for me was that Tom told me that he didn't think it was a big deal. And I realized it wasn't institutional knowledge why term length matters. And there was a lesson for me, but it was still a deception that had to be handled as such. Now, another rep had the same challenge, and I'll call her Rachel. She worked with me to write a side letter as an addendum to the contract that would require us to send the customer a 45-day notice before auto renewal of their contract. It wouldn't give them an out, but if we weren't meeting the terms of the agreement, they could terminate for cause. So no material change to the agreement, but it made the customer feel better. And, it required some internal process tweaks because the customer success folks had to be aware of the communication that would be required. But in this particular case, the rep who made the mistake doubled down and emphasized that they didn't understand the big deal and missed a major opportunity to redeem themselves. And that mistake was due to several issues that would be possible to work on if Tom was willing to own his shortfalls.
Interesting. curious, and you might not be able to share it in case it could be figured out, Katie, but I'm really fascinated by how sales professionals are dealt with, knowing that they're the revenue generators, and whether they're held in maybe a different light because of that. I've seen examples where mistakes from sales leaders are overlooked or minimized because their value is so high in the organization.
Oof, you are going to open a can of worms for me, and it's something where it's going to seem like I'm a turncoat to my own profession. But I think that sales is one of the last bastions in companies where there's a convincing that it's some kind of like black magic and, sort of sorcery, when it's still it's very systematic, much like marketing became very data driven. Sales has the same type of anatomy physiology where there's a process that's anatomical and like sort of very similar across all deals. And there's a physiology of it moving. And I do, to your point, I think that sales folks have subconsciously yet also intentionally set things up so that they're beyond reproach, because there's a lot of fear about holding us accountable and like what we could possibly do, in a sense that the power that we're exerting is vague and completely within our control and our understanding, that makes the rest of the organization sort of have this sort of fearfulness of interrupting it. And I don't think that that's by accident. I personally am not that kind of leader. Like personally, my values are the customer first and what their experience is going to be like. To your point, the thing is that that how those types of situations are handled also from in organization to organization be very different depending on the politics of how Tom was viewed. Right. So if Tom was a very high performing sales rep, there are organizations that would say, well, we can overlook this and actually not barely even address it. I've seen that happen. Wow. They just go, yeah, Tom, listen, you got to break a couple eggs to make an omelet kind of thing. And, even in certain cases where Rachel would be almost dinged for having been too cautious and possibly risking a deal. Like this happens. This is part of the reality of how some organizations are crafted. So yeah, so the whole thing about making mistakes within a sales organization and in any organization there's also the kind of the impact of politics.
Well, I've been on the other side of your group. So as an outsider, one of my first jobs was running the B2B CRM program at Tiffany's. So our internal customers was the Salesforce. And we had a number of processes that they were required to follow. And I could not count how often I heard of how much of a burden that everything in my role was for them. And those who refused to follow them would always cite how much money they brought in. It was just like, wait for it. It's like, it's like, oh, you really need to make sure this is uploaded in the CRM. And it's like, it's like, so luckily for me, Tiffany saw the value in the compulsory processes because they were instilled for the greater good of the organization, as you just said. And so I was backed up there culturally. Yeah. And Salesforce had to comply or risk losing their bonus. They had a pretty aggressive, at the time, this is some years ago, so I don't know what it is now, but you don't do this, you don't get a bonus. It was very, very black and white. But I have seen, to your point, other cultures where that wasn't the case, and because I bring in the money, became the standard trope, which some folks pointed to whenever they messed up. And aside from creating a splintered culture and some organizational chaos, at least in my rigid operational view, it also feels like people are cheating themselves out of an opportunity to learn and grow.
Yeah, and I've seen that in my organizations. I've had performers of all different levels of capability and capacity begin to move into this entitlement. I've had a lot of very like high performing organizations. And one of the things that just kind of naturally happens is they start to think like, look what we're doing, because the business, as they start bringing in business, it changes the business. I'd put this in the podcast in terms of just advisement for anyone who is seeing this and is overseeing a revenue organization, is being aware that it's like, yeah, you bring the money in, but the people who are making the product, the people who are delivering it, these are the people that are making it possible for you to sell the way you're selling. They're the people who are making it possible to have referrals. They're the people that are making it possible for you to hold your head up high when you're telling your customer about the level of quality of what their experience is going to be. So this idea that just, this one inflection point of being able to close a deal, it's like, try closing a deal with a low quality product, right? And so one of the things that I had introduced in one of my organizations, I've actually never done this again, but it was in one particular team. It was a wonderful team, but there was this thing happening where folks were getting really like entitled because they were watching the fact that they were completely transforming the company, the shape of it, everything about it. And so I created something called like the Team Names Award. And it was for folks outside of the revenue organization who were positively impacting our ability to deliver. I think it was like once a month, and people could nominate and explain why. And then for our team meeting, we would bring someone in, it'd be from operations, from finance, from wherever. We'd bring them in and we would present them an award and say, this is because you're making it possible, for us to succeed at the level that we are right now. And it was kind of a message to the team. Like, honestly, like for me, the reason I did it, I was like, they like to bring some consciousness to the fact, it's like, you're not doing this alone. We're not doing this alone. And also to the organization to say, thank you for making it possible for us to have such a great product to sell and to make so much money and to be in such an awesome position.
Hey, fellow psychos, if you enjoyed the show, please click like, subscribe, and share it with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so please hit us up on our socials. We're at Business Psychos Pod on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.